This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Okay, in the second module, we're going to start to get into the actual development environment here. So we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the development environment and the installation steps. One of the things Hans and I have both discovered when we're teaching Android is that the bootstrapping process, getting all the different components installed and organized on your desktop, can be a little bit confusing. Now, we did announce in the tutorial announcement that you should get this stuff installed before. So we're assuming you already have it running. So this is an overview, so you can kind of look back in the dust in your rearview mirror and know what you actually did. And those of you that may have had trouble getting it installed, hopefully this will help clarify the step-by-step sequence that you need to do. So once we have our development environment set up, then we're going to actually go in, do our first Hello World, and walk through it. So the Android development consists of basically 4 components. So we're going to assume that you have the JDK version 6 installed by default, and we're also going to assume that you have Eclipse 3.4 or more recent. The documentation on the Android.com calls for 3.4 or 3.5, but we have tested 3.6 works. The most recent version works as well. So Eclipse is, of course, the Java IDE that Android integrates with, but you don't have to use Eclipse if you don't want to. But we are going to in this tutorial because that's kind of the standard approach. So Eclipse, there's an ADT plugin, Android Developer Tools, which is basically going to let us manage and work with Android projects in Eclipse. And then the 4th component is the actual Android SDK. So once again, the things over on the left here are required. Those are absolutely essential to do Android development. And the Eclipse IDE is optional. So if you have other ways you like to edit and work with Java projects, you can pursue that path with Android. But we're going to kind of stick with the standard path of using Eclipse. So it really isn't that hard to get the SDK in a development environment established on your desktop. And on Android.com, there is a really nice quick start guide that will help you get started. And I have the URL for that on the bottom of the slide here. But basically, it's just a 3-step process. So we're going to assume up front that you have JDK version 6 installed and Eclipse 3.5. And so once you have that ready, basically there's 3 things. The first step you're going to do is download and install the Android SDK starter package. Once you've done that, you're going to go and install ADT, Android Developer Tools, into Eclipse. So that's an Eclipse plugin. And then once you have those 2 things in place, you can go and add the Android platforms and other components using the Android SDK and AVD Manager tool. So let's just take a look at each of these steps in a little bit more detail. And so I've kind of cut pieces out of that quick start installer guide on Android.com. So you can establish an Android development environment on Windows, Mac OS X, or Linux, so it's truly cross-platform. So whatever you're using of those 3, you can easily get Android up and running. And so you're going to download the appropriate starter package. Okay, so for each of these platforms, there's a different package. Once you've downloaded that, you're going to unpack it on your disk drive, and then you need to adjust your system path environment. So the executables in those tools that you've downloaded are available to in your environment. And of course, that differs a little bit by platform. So if you're on Linux or Mac, you're basically going to want to add the path of the tools directory into your .bash profile. Okay, so you need to get to a terminal window and pull up in a text editor that file, create it if it doesn't exist already in your environment, and adjust that. If you're a Windows user, it's a little bit different. You need to go to My Computer on your desktop, select Properties, and then under that Advanced tab, you're going to see a button, Environment Variables, And then once you do that, you're going to have a dialog listing out all those environment variables. You're going to double-click on path, and you're going to add the full path to the tools subdirectory where you've unpacked that starter install package. Okay? And this is covered in a little bit more detail, again, on that quick start guide on the Android site that you can look at. The link is here on the bottom of the view graph. So once you've installed that starter package and you've adjusted your path, now you need to bring up Eclipse and install the plugin, the ADT plugin. And it's slightly different. How you accomplish this in 3.4 is slightly different in 3.5. We won't go through the gory details here, but basically you're going to go in there and you're going to add a site. If you're familiar with Eclipse, you're going to know exactly what this is. If you haven't used Eclipse yet and you're using it for the first time because you want to do Android development, once again, all the details are there. But basically, you're getting the ADT plugin installed in Eclipse. And then there's one last little step you need to do here. Once you've got that plugin, you have to go back and tell Eclipse where your SDK directory is, so where you've unpacked that starter package. And so if you go to the Windows submenu, Preferences, and of course on a Mac, you go to the Application, pull down on Finder, Eclipse, and preferences are always under there, so slightly different there. And you're going to go down, you're going to see this Preferences dialog, you're going to click on Android on the left, and then basically in the SDK location field, simply tell it where you unpacked that archive. Once you've done that, Eclipse is going to know where all these tools are that it needs to manage your Android projects. All right, so now we've downloaded the starter kit. We've got Eclipse primed and ready with the ADT plugin. Now what we need to do is go and actually install the platforms. So Android is a fast-moving train. It's work in progress. And very frequently, Google does another point release and comes out with a whole new raft of new features. Okay, so just this week, Sprint, for example, is pushing out Froyo to their Android devices, which is Android 2.2, which was announced, I guess in late May. So every few months, Android revs, and these devices, not all of them, some devices are still on 1.5, but most of the devices get these updates, and of course every rev, there's lots of new fun features for developers to take advantage of. So once you've got the ADT installed, there's an option in Eclipse to start up the Android SDK and AVD Manager, and you're going to basically see this window that is in front of you. If you click on the available packages, you're going to see all the platform revs that are currently supported by Google, and you're going to click the check boxes by the ones you want. Now you're going to be tempted to always develop on the latest rev. And that's fine if you're just trying to figure out what's new and you want to use the bleeding edge stuff. But if you're actually going to deploy, you're probably going to want to pick up these older ones too, and you're probably going to want to program to like 1.6, okay? Because if you want the widest penetration, if you want the most users to use your app, you're going to want to support some of those older versions because there's still a critical mass of devices out there that are running on those. So you're going to check the versions you want. I typically grab everything that's available when I do this, and then basically install. Now this step will take a while because there's a lot of stuff that's going to be downloaded there from the Google site. So this is basically how you're going to pick up all the different platforms. Okay, so once again, we kind of did a whirlwind overview here of the development process, but it really is as easy as 1, 2, 3. And I put the link to the detailed guide on the bottom of each of these slides. So if you're still confused, you can go reference it there. And we can also, in our breaks, Hans or I can go around and help you get your platform established if you haven't gotten that already. What I want to do now is I actually want to move over into Eclipse where I've done this install that I just covered, and I've got everything configured. And what I want to do is just do the first thing we always do when we're learning a new platform or a new language, basically create a Hello World application for Android. So I'm going to switch over to Eclipse. And this is Eclipse, and like I've mentioned, I've got ADT all installed here. And what I want to do now is just create a program, an Android program. So I'm going to go to my File menu, and I'm going to say New, and I'm going to pick Android Project. Okay, and I'm going to call this project Android Intro. And I'm going to create a new project in my workspace. And then I have to pick an API level here. And this basically means which version of the Android platform am I going to target. And I'm going to go with 1.6 because that'll give me 1.5 would give me the broadest coverage, but I'm just going to go with 1.6. There's a critical mass of devices out there. And let's see, what else oh, there's more here that it's not showing. Scroll down, and now I need to have an application name. So we'll say Android Intro. Package name, and you'll use the Java conventions you're familiar with. Typically, you'll use your organization's domain to make sure it's unique. So we're going to go edu, gvsu, and since we're the School of Computing, we'll say CIS. And then we need to create at least one activity. Okay, remember, every application has one or more activities, and we have to specify a name for that. So we'll call it Intro Activity, and let's say for Min SDK, this basically is going to be used to describe that app. So when we do deploy it in the Android market eventually, we're not going to deploy this, but if we did, it basically will determine which devices this application can actually run on. So I'm just going to put level 4 here, SDK version 4, which is equivalent to 1.6. And if I say finish, it went and it created a new skeleton application, and it's compiling. That's why you see the error. Okay. So I've just created a skeleton Android application here, and if I expand it in Eclipse, you'll see a number of subdirectories here. The first one is the source subdirectory, and as you might expect, this is where my source code, my Java source code for my Android application is going to be. Then there's a gen subdirectory, and what's happening here is that ADT plugin that we installed in Eclipse, as we edit our project files, is going to generate some source code, okay, that is used along with the source code that we author by hand, and this is to manage resources, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So for right now, that gen subdirectory is where there is some generated source code that the tooling is putting together for us, and this is just a reference to the Android 1.6 platform. The assets directory is empty here, but the assets directory is where I can put extra information. So if I had some data files that my application was going to use that I wanted to be installed with the application package, I can put them under assets. The resource subdirectory is basically all the resources that my application uses. So any types of bitmap images, any types of screen layouts, okay, and also string data. Okay, one of the things you need to think about if you're going to write an Android application or any mobile application is you might want this application to be available in markets other than North America. Okay, so you may need to have different language translations of your application. So that type of data we don't embed in the source code. Okay, we want to use the same binary code for a German version of our application that we do in English. So typically we're going to take all that textual data that our application puts in front of the users, and we're going to put that outside in resource files. They're XML files. We're going to keep it separate from the code. Okay? So these are the types of artifacts that you're going to find in the resource directory. It's basically all the images and other types of data, non-code data that your application depends on. Up at the top level, we have this file called Android Manifest.xml. And the Android Manifest is basically a bunch of metadata about this application package. And the Eclipse, the ADT plugin here in Eclipse is giving us a nice kind of high-level way to edit the different parts of this manifest. Okay, but I'm going to go all the way to the right here to the XML tab, and the Android manifest.xml is, as you might expect, an XML file. And this is, for this particular application, this is what the manifest looks like. It names the package, and notice this is what I put in that dialog when I created the project. It's got an application version name, so we can introduce an application to the Android market, but over time, as we fix bugs and add new features, we can keep revving our application, and the users of our application will get a little notification on their phone that says there's another version available, and they can download it and update their copy of our application. So the version name, that piece of information that tells the user you're using 1.5 or whatever, that's in the manifest. And the manifest also defines an application element, and there's an icon here. And as you might expect, when we install the application on the phone, there's going to be an icon on the window, on the home screen, that lets the user launch the application. So we can customize that icon. So that's what this element does. And there's also a string label on that that describes the name of our application. And then inside that application element, you're going to have one or more activities. Okay? So remember, an activity is basically kind of a task that we're going to carry out on behalf of a user, and one application, one Android application, can have one or more of these activities. So in this application I just created, we have one activity, and you'll remember that I gave the name of it. I called it intro activity. Okay? And then I also mentioned in the previous segment intent filters, and I said, you know, intents are the ways that applications use to transfer from activity to activity. Well, here's an intent filter in my manifest for this activity that I created in my sample app here, and it's got a name of action.main, and it's got a category of launcher. Okay? And this particular intent is basically saying, if the user clicks on this application's icon on the menu, this is the activity we want you to start running. Okay, so this is kind of like, you could say, our main routine if we were talking C or C++. Okay, so this intent filter is sort of defining the entry point for this particular application. Okay, finally, the other file we have here at the top level is the default properties. Okay, and the default properties, among other things, is going to basically contain information, this is a generated file as well, about what platform we're currently supporting. So one of the things I want to do here is drill down a little bit more under resources into the layout directory. So typically in Android, you are going to define your user interfaces declaratively in an XML file. Okay? So you're going to have these XML files that describe the layout of the visual elements on the screen. And in this application, when I went through the project creation wizard, it created this main.xml, which is a really simple layout of a UI for this particular application. So up at the top, we see an element called a linear layout. Okay, and we'll talk in the next segment in more detail about layouts and different layout strategies and UIs and so forth. But for now, a linear layout is just something that lets us lay out a list of view elements in a linear fashion. So we can lay them out horizontally, or we can lay them out vertically. You'll see here I've got a attribute here called Android orientation, and it's set to vertical. Okay? So this linear layout is going to take one or more views and just lay them out in a vertical fashion. And I've only got one view here. It's a text view. Okay? And the text view is basically going to be as wide as the parent, which is the linear view, so it's going to fill the whole screen. And this wrap content basically says, for the height, use as much space as you need. Okay? So I'm going to have some default font when I display this text view, and the platform is going to figure out how tall is that font, and that's how big this particular text view is going to be. Now notice the Android text attribute here. It's got this funny @string/hello. Okay, and remember I talked about internationalization a few minutes ago, where you really don't want to hard code string literals into your application, because if you're deploying a mobile app, you want to think about multiple markets. So you want to keep that stuff outside of the app. And this is how you do it. So this @string here says this string is defined elsewhere in another XML file. In fact, it's under values, and it's a file called strings.xml. And if you look, there's a string element in here with an attribute name hello, and it says hello world intro activity. So if I go back to my main, this reference here says this text view that you're going to put up on the screen, okay, get the actual literal string data out of this XML file, strings.xml, and that's the actual text you're going to display. Okay? So if I wanted to do a German version of this, I could create a new file, a new translation of strings.xml in German, okay, and my program stays the same. It's just using different resource data to populate those fields. Okay, so that's the main.xml is where my Hello World's program's user interface is declaratively defined. But you might be wondering, how do we actually get this to run and appear on the screen? Well, we did create an activity. We named an activity in the wizard called intro activity, and this is a really, really simple activity that was generated by the tools, which accomplishes, which basically is going to take that view that we defined and put it up on the screen. So notice here I've defined a new class, intro activity, okay, and it's extending the base class activity, just like we talked about in the previous segment. And in this case, it's overriding only the single method onCreate. Okay, and you may remember when we talked about the activity lifecycle, when an activity is started for the first time, it needs to be created, it's going to call this onCreate hook method, okay, and we're going to call the hook in the base class onCreate, and then we call this method setContentView. Okay, so this setContentView is saying, okay, when this activity gets created, this is the view that we want you to render on the screen. And now if you look at the parameter here, you're saying, well, what's that? r.layout.main. Well, remember I told you there is some generated code here? So if we go down into the gen directory, you'll see this r.java file. Okay? This gets generated by the tooling. So what happens is when we write these XML layout files, when we describe what UIs want to look like, and we give these things names, basically the tools underneath, when we save that file, is going to generate this r.java. Okay? In fact, the very presence of this main.xml file triggers the generation of this definition by the tools. Okay? So I have a class called layout. This is a nested class within my class R, and it defines this static int main. Okay? And basically what's happening behind the scenes here is this is just a handle that gives me programmatic reference to the resource I defined in XML. So when I come back into my code here in Java and I say set content view to r.layout.main, what I'm really saying here is, hey, you know that layout that I defined in main.xml? That's what I want you to put on the screen right here. Okay, so it's a little bit convoluted, but basically this is the way we can define the UIs themselves in XML and then programmatically refer to them and manipulate them in Java. Okay? So that's it. That's basically a Hello World program. Let's run it, okay, and take a look at what it does. Now, there's a couple of things I could do here as a developer. I could take my Android device, plug in a USB cable, plug in that device, and when I run it, I have the option to actually have it installed and deployed on this device. Okay? In fact, I can even do onboard debugging, right? So I can set breakpoints in my source code here, and I can actually, as it's running on the actual device, I can stop, look at variables, and trace what's going on, debug my code. The other thing that the Android SDK gives us is an emulator. And the emulator is basically a virtual instance of an Android device. And you can create all kinds of different versions of these emulators. So if you're targeting different screen size, different form factors, and so forth, you can go back into that SDK Manager AVD tool that we looked at originally, and you can create new emulator instances. So I've already created an emulator instance, and I have it running here on my desktop. Okay, it's a fairly standard one. It's targeting, it's running Froyo, Android 2.2. And what I'm going to do now is, I don't have a USB cable to hook the device up here, so we're just going to run this application on the emulator that comes with the Android SDK. So I'm going to select my project here, and normally the first time you do this, you're going to right-click and you're going to say Run as an Android application. And I've already done this, so it remembers it. So if I just click the Run button here, I guess it didn't. No, I just created this one. So I didn't. So it's going to ask me what kind of application are you trying to run here. It's an Android application, and now it's installing it. And if we switch over to here, momentarily, okay. So there's my hello world. Okay, so the application runs. The Android intro activity is started. Remember, that was the intent filter, that when you click that icon, that's what's going to run. And it puts up that single text view, which was the only thing we defined there. And notice the string came out of the strings.xml. Okay, it's not hard-coded in the program. Okay, the other thing it will do is it will put this on the application menu. So there it's here. So this is the actual applications available on this emulator device. So I can run it here as well by clicking it. Okay, and notice I'm hitting the back arrow, the back button here to get back to the home screen. Okay, so it's very simple to actually do Android development and test your applications without having the physical device. Although before you deploy, you'd always want to test on as many of these physical devices as possible. The other thing I want to show you is how easy it is to actually debug an application. Okay, so if you're familiar with Eclipse, you really don't have anything to learn here. I'm just going to go over here, and let's say I want to set a breakpoint right when I enter this element. So when the framework calls my onCreate hook function or hook method, I want to trap and have the debugger start so I can actually step through the code, look at variable values, and so forth. So I'm going to double-click over here in this little gray area. That set the breakpoint, that little blue dot. And then I'm going to just click on the bug here, and it's going to start running. And notice before the application can run, Eclipse says to me, we're going to change the perspective. You were in code edit mode. Now we're going to bring you into debug mode. Is that OK? And I'm going to say, yeah. In fact, why don't you remember that and do that always? And so now it's going to switch to the debug perspective. And there I am. I have a little blue arrow here, and it says you're trapped on this instruction here. And it's waiting for me to tell it what to do next. I can come in here. Here's my this reference to my activity class. I can look at all the values. Okay? And I can also step. So if I do a function F6, now I'm stepping through my code. I can hit a continue. Okay, now it's running. If I go back here, my application's running. Okay? Now, if I had a device hooked up here, the process is exactly the same. Okay, so everything looks the same from the development environment. Okay, and I should mention in the emulator, those commonly pre-installed applications are available here. So here's the Google Maps. And these are actually available and running. They're leveraging my, my network connection on my host computer here. Okay, so this is the Google Apps, or the Google Maps application. I can run a web browser somewhere in here, browser. Okay, so it's actually live, it's running. So if we want to pull up the Grand Valley website. Okay, and it's going to look just like it would on the actual device. Not too great. Okay. Okay, so in this module, we've established our Android development environment. We've written our first Hello World application, and we've kind of walked through the basic anatomy of an Android project and gotten familiar with the different parts. And then we've ran our application in the emulator, and we've taken a look at how to debug applications right on our desktop computer. Okay? In the next module, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Hans, and he's going to introduce us to Android user interface basics.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.